Where there's a dead body, there's a story to be told. One of illness, neglect, or sadness. A life extinguished. But sometimes the body tells a different story. One of anger and violence. When investigators exhaust every avenue, they turn to groundbreaking forensics to unravel fake alibis and reveal true motives. It takes true genius. This is killer forensics. In the early 2000s, a serial killer was roaming the streets of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He left his DNA on the bodies, and some of his crimes even had witnesses. Yet investigators on the case found it impossible to identify him. They eventually turned to a little-used and controversial form of DNA analysis. The astonishing results revealed that their killer was not the man they thought he was. 22-year-old Mary Pace had just completed her master's degree in business at Louisiana State University. She was looking forward to starting a new job. On a Friday afternoon, after running some errands, she went home for lunch. There are no witnesses to what happened next.
It was probably one of the worst scenes I'd ever seen in 16 years of homicide investigation.
When Mary's flatmate got home, she thought it strange that Mary had left a plate of half-eaten food sitting on a chair.
Mary? And then she walked into her bedroom and was just in waves of horror. Murray, she had very little clothing on, and she had been stabbed. It was just a horrible scene.
Murray's room had been the site of a violent struggle. With ultraviolet light, detectives found some traces of biological evidence at the scene. But it was a seemingly random connection to another murder that turned the case.
Right near the coffee table was the base of a cordless telephone. It was missing from the cradle. We determined that some of the items was consistent with what was taken from Gina Green's residence as well. Gina Green had a cell phone taken. Murray Pace had the home phone taken.
6 months earlier, 41-year-old Gina Green had been found strangled in her own bed. At the time, police suspected she'd gone out the night before and ended up with the wrong man. Everyone thought her murder was an isolated incident, including Murray Pace, who lived just 3 doors away. But the investigators now wondered if there might be a connection between Gina and Murray. When Gina's body was found, there was a tiny bloodstain on the sleeve of her blouse. It suggested she'd elbowed her attacker and caused him to bleed. Unfortunately, a search of police DNA databases hadn't provided a hit. Forensic technicians now compared the blood on Gina's blouse to the biological evidence found on Murray. They were a match. The same killer had been at both crime scenes. But the investigators had no idea who he was.
That's got to be the most frustrating feeling, to know that you have the exact identity. You've got his absolute DNA profile. You just don't have a face.
The killer's MO was the same in both cases. He left no fingerprints. There was no sign of forced entry. There were no witnesses. And he took phones, perhaps to remove evidence, or possibly as a memento.
There was 600,000 people in this area that was absolutely terrorized by what was happening, and particularly women.
There were internet rumors that were circulating. One was that the killer used a tape recording of a baby crying to lure his victims out.
A lot of the rumors, it was possibly a police officer because nobody's seen the individual.
2 months later, in a suburb east of Baton Rouge, 44-year-old Pamela Kinnemore's husband returned home.
He noticed that her keys were in the door. But apparently that was not that unusual for Pam. He walked into the house and called her name and didn't see her. And then he went to the bedroom, bathroom area. Her bath was run, but she wasn't there. There was some blood on the carpet. So he immediately called police officers.
Pam Kinnamore, another beautiful, successful woman, had vanished. The local community quickly launched a search, hoping to find her alive. 3 days later, her body was found in a remote area off Whiskey Bay.
The person chose an area of Louisiana off Whiskey Bay, a place that's not well traveled, a place that you would have to know where you're going. I think that if you want to hide your tracks, if you want to throw authorities off, if you want to make sure that the bodies of the victims won't be found for a long time, this is one of the places that you would try to use to disguise and conceal the location of the victims.
Nearby was an eerily familiar piece of evidence, a telephone cord, cut with a serrated knife. But it hadn't come from Pam's house, nor from any of the other known crime scenes. Was there a fourth, as yet undiscovered, victim? DNA analysis revealed that Pam Kinnemore's killer was the same man who'd killed Gina Green and Murray Pace. His identity remained a mystery, but this time there were witnesses. 2 people came forward on separate occasions, saying they'd seen Pam in a white truck with a white man. This information was shared with the public. Thousands of leads poured in, and during the course of the investigation, DNA samples were collected from hundreds of suspects who fitted the description. None of them matched the evidence from the crime scenes. As the summer came to an end, there were still no major breakthroughs in the case.
And then the next thing you know, another beautiful woman would turn up abducted and murdered.
23-year-old Tronisha Danae Colomb went to visit her mother's grave and never came home. 3 days later, a hunter found her body in a wooded area some distance away. She was only partly clothed and had been beaten to death. DNA evidence confirmed her as the 4th victim of the man now known as the Baton Rouge serial killer. The community was panicked. No one knew when he might strike next.
You got where you were just sitting there holding your breath waiting for the next one. And who's it going to be?
The scientists working Danae's case found a potentially significant clue when they were processing the DNA evidence from the scene. They discovered a rare marker in the killer's genetic profile.
One of the forensic scientists at the state police lab had noticed that the serial killer profile had a rare marker. When I was working Danae's case, I did happen to notice that it was coming up on the results as I was watching them come off over the instrument. And kind of like a little light went off in my head that, hey, that's that rare marker.
Investigators now wondered if this rare marker could hold the key to the killer's identity. Before they could find out, a 5th woman disappeared from home. 26-year-old Carrie Yoder was an environmental studies grad student at Louisiana State University. Her body was found 10 days later at Whiskey Bay, though in a different location to Pam Kinnemore. The investigators were desperate to prevent any further deaths. In a bold move, they turned to a controversial form of forensic science in a last-ditch attempt to identify and catch their man. Police in Louisiana had a serial killer on their hands. 5 young women were dead. Yet despite having the killer's complete DNA profile, plus eyewitness descriptions of him, investigators had no idea who he was. Out of options, they turned to a controversial form of cutting-edge technology. The investigators contacted DNA Print Genomics, a laboratory that specialized in a technique known as ancestral profiling.
Ancestry testing is a way of looking at information in your DNA that tells you where your ancestors came from, what parts of the world. There's basically information and signatures in people's DNA makeup that has clues to which continents their predecessors, the people in their family, have come from. And by extracting that information, you can do some fairly straightforward math and figure out how likely somebody is to belong to a given group of people.
DNA profiles are often used to identify a perpetrator from within a group of suspects. But the same techniques can also be used to place an individual within a particular racial group.
To do the ancestry testing, it just requires a number of steps in the lab. The first is usually isolating some kind of DNA from a biological sample. They'll send us isolated DNA to work with. What we do next is we have to extract the information from the DNA that's important for the ancestry testing. And that requires a number of chemistry steps involving something called polymerase chain reaction to make extra copies. And then basically we just do some sequencing. And what sequencing is understanding which of the 4 DNA alphabet letters are present at a given position in the DNA.
After days of painstaking work, the scientists were able to establish an ancestral lineage for their suspect. And the results came as a shock. The killer's ancestry was 85% sub-Saharan African and 15% Native American.
The very vast majority of leads that we had were on white males. So obviously there's a big conflict here.
This new genetic profile turned the investigation upside down. The police now had to radically alter the description of the man they believed had killed Gina Green, Murray Pace, Pamela Kinnemore, Tanisha Dene Colomb, and Carrie Yoder. Their interest was piqued by an incident that had been reported several months earlier, 3 days before Pamela Kinnemore had disappeared. In Breaux Bridge, a small town 45 minutes west of Baton Rouge, a woman had been home alone when a black man had come to her door and asked to use her phone. Once inside, he'd cut the phone cord and violently attacked her. Her son had arrived home just in time to prevent tragedy. The attacker fled, and as he left, the son noticed the cut phone cord hanging out of his car door. This was the clue that now attracted the attention of the serial killer task force. The woman was able to give a detailed description of her attacker. A sketch was made and released to the public, and calls began to flood in. They all identified the sketch as the same man, 34-year-old Derek Todd Lee. Lee was a manual labourer with a criminal history. He had previous arrests for burglary, assault, and being a peeping Tom, but nothing serious enough that a DNA sample had ever been required. An astonishing coincidence was about to change that. Detectives in Zachary, north of Baton Rouge, had been quietly working a cold case. In 1998, a young mother had disappeared from her home. A neighbour had found the woman's son playing on her front lawn. When she checked inside the boy's house, she found evidence of a violent struggle and no sign of the boy's mother. One of the suspects at the time had been local Peeping Tom, Derek Todd Lee. The cold case investigators had recently been granted a court order to obtain Lee's DNA. He was tracked down and swabbed, and when the sample was sent for testing, the local investigator worked a hunch.
When I turned it in to the crime lab, I just said, you know, we're turning this in for testing on DNA. It's Derek Todd Lee, and feel free to look through the serial murders that are going on in Baton Rouge.
When Lee's DNA was processed, it matched the profile of the Baton Rouge serial killer.
And I can relate it to just being hit by a tidal wave almost when I got that phone call.
To hear the scientists tell us his name is Derek Todd Lee, you know, I can remember writing it down, you know, for the very first time, and just a great feeling, you know, that all this coming together saved a life. Could not bring one back, but you know, we're going to save someone in the community, and you just knew this was going to end. The madness was going to end.
Lee was tracked to a motel in Atlanta, Georgia, and arrested.
You know, right now my life on the line, and you know that we talked about this last night. My life on the line, you know what I'm saying?
He refused to admit to any involvement in the serial killings. Only forensic evidence could prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Key to the prosecution's case was the phone cord found near the body of Pamela Kinnemore. There was a serrated knife pattern on the cut end. Under a microscope, forensic experts were able to match this piece of cord to the cut phone cord in the Breaux Bridge attack. This evidence placed Derek Todd Lee with Pamela Kinnemore's body and identified him as the Baton Rouge serial killer.
Here's an 18-foot section of phone cord taken from this house, and there's another one right over here, like 40 miles away. How did that get there? One person, that's the only link between those two things getting there is the killer.
But ultimately, it was the victims themselves who provided the best evidence.
The DNA was incredibly important in this case. He tried to destroy or take evidence from every scene, but what he overlooked most of the time was the evidence that was on the victims' bodies themselves. What he didn't understand, that these victims themselves were the strongest piece of evidence against him.
In 2004, Derek Todd Lee was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. He is currently on death row at the Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola. It was the controversial technique of ancestral profiling that turned the case and led investigators to connect the attack by a black man to the serial killings they thought had been committed by a white man. Some people see it as a form of racial profiling, and it remains controversial. But in this case, it undoubtedly helped put a serial killer behind bars. Investigators around the world are always working on new ways to unlock forensic secrets in hard-to-crack cases. These next crimes were all solved by truly groundbreaking techniques. When the body of Martha Hanson was discovered, she had been brutally raped, tortured, and beaten nearly beyond recognition. Her attack had been so physical that investigators wondered if the killer could have left fingerprints on Martha's skin. One of the most effective methods of getting prints off hard surfaces is superglue fuming. The evidence is placed in a sealed chamber, then superglue is introduced and heated until it becomes a gas. As the gas cools, it coats the evidence in a thin film, which highlights any ridge detail left behind by fingerprints. But using this technique to lift prints from skin is a different story. Often the main problem is body temperature. It's difficult to capture ridge detail on cold skin. But in this case, the body had been found quickly, and the summer temperatures had kept it warm. So the investigators came up with an ingenious plan. Instead of bringing the evidence to the lab, they brought the lab to the evidence. Using items from a local hardware store, they constructed a fuming chamber at the scene. It was a plan with a potentially deadly flaw. If superglue reaches more than 200 degrees Celsius, it produces cyanide gas, and out in the field, it was impossible to precisely control the temperature inside the chamber. After doing what they could to minimize the risk, the investigators put their makeshift chamber to the test and got a result. A clear palm print, which they were later able to match to their prime suspect, Evans Lee Curtis. Curtis had been identified on CCTV leaving a bar with Martha. He was the adopted son of one of Martha's friends and knew her well. He never explained why he'd killed her. The palm print was crucial to the prosecution's case. Curtis was convicted of murder and is currently serving a 99-year sentence. Groundbreaking experts often go to extreme lengths to prove their case. Sometimes they even put their own lives on the line. 72-year-old Vince Diamante was found brutally murdered in his own home. Just a few months later, and a few blocks away, 71-year-old Red Collie met the same fate. When ballistics experts examined the bullet that had killed Vince Diamante, they discovered traces of neoprene on it. Neoprene is a substance used to make wetsuits and mouse mats. Wedged into the shear marks on a bullet, it suggested the use of a homemade silencer. The police were concerned they had a serial killer on their hands, one who was preying on the elderly for fun. Their prime suspect was local man Jojo Miller, and under interrogation one day, he unexpectedly confessed to having built a silencer using neoprene. He even drew a sketch of his invention, detailing exactly how he'd built it. But there was a problem. Miller refused to confess to either murder, and the rest of the evidence against him was all circumstantial. For the silencer evidence to stand up in court, the investigators needed to prove that his design had been used in the murder of Vince Diamante. They called on firearms expert Mike Peck with a potentially lethal request.
I received a telephone call, and the I'd call said, "Can I make a silencer?"
Despite decades of experience with the bomb squad and law enforcement, this was one of the most dangerous challenges Peck had ever faced.
You have to be precise enough to make sure that the bullet goes all the way through the silencer without touching anything. And if it does, then guess what? This thing could blow up on you.
Peck started by making his own blueprint for the silencer based on Miller's sketch. He then painstakingly crafted all the parts by hand.
It wasn't just a simple thing. It was an extreme process. You're showing premeditation. You're showing the ability to cunningly plan your crime and cunningly execute that crime. And in this case, it happened to be murder.
3 weeks later, the silencer was ready to test. The bullets exhibited exactly the same shear marks as the bullet that had killed Vince Diamante. This unique signature, the result of a tiny malfunction in the design, put Jojo Miller at the scene of Vince's murder. He later confessed to the murder of Red Collie. Miller's MO was to befriend elderly men. Then one day, when he knew they'd be home alone, he'd pay them a final visit. And this time, it wasn't a social call. He was sentenced to life for the 2 murders, and committed suicide in prison a year later. In some cases, the suspect is obvious. The hard part is finding an expert who can prove their guilt. When 20-year-old Rochelle Tollison's badly burned body was discovered in a remote woodland area, investigators quickly focused on the fire itself. The logs used to fuel the fire were mesquite, which wasn't indigenous to the area, and on the night Rochelle had disappeared, there was a party with a mesquite bonfire just a few blocks from her house. The wood for the bonfire had been provided by one of the party guests, Moses Mendoza. The police wondered if it was possible to match the wood from the party with the wood used to burn the body and identify Mendoza as the killer. They turned to Dr. Matavi Martin, an expert in laser-induced breakdown spectroscopy. This is where a laser is used to evaporate wood, releasing a brief flash of light. The light can then be measured and analysed to reveal the chemical makeup of that particular piece of wood, a unique combination of elements from the soil it came from and pollutants from the surrounding environment. It was the first time this technology had been used in a murder case, but when Dr. Martin tested samples of wood from both fires, the results were better than anyone had expected.
We did statistical analysis on the data that I had acquired and found out that they were 99.995% similar to each other. Either they were parts of the same tree, or they came from trees in the same geographical area, or they were from the same clump of trees.
This stunning result cracked the case and placed Moses Mendoza at the scene of the crime. Mendoza was a former classmate of Rochelle. He eventually confessed. He had kidnapped her, strangled her until she lost consciousness, raped her, then stabbed her in the neck and dumped her body behind his house. It was later, when the police began asking questions, that he'd taken the body to the woods and tried to burn it. The only explanation he ever gave for his actions was that he'd been drunk. Moses Mendoza was sentenced to death. He is currently on death row. In many cases, the challenge for investigators isn't working out what to investigate, it's working out how to investigate it. When a tried and tested method doesn't already exist, the best investigators don't give up. They go out and invent one. At a local restaurant in the small town of Bellevue, Greg May and his new girlfriend, Janet Barnes, were excitedly planning their future. They decided to move to Florida together. Until then, Janet was going to move in with Greg. Later that day, she arrived at Greg's flat with her things, but no one answered the door. She peered through the window and was met with an unsettling sight. Greg was seated at the kitchen table and his female flatmate was pacing back and forth. Instantly, Janet felt that something was terribly wrong. She rushed to the back door and tried to find a way in. But Greg continued to act as if Janet didn't exist. Janet wasn't the only person to suddenly be ignored by Greg. He also stopped calling his son, Don. Don suspected that Greg's two flatmates, Doug and Julie Johnson, were somehow to blame. Greg and Doug had met back in the 1970s. Greg was an established tattoo artist, and Doug had been keen to learn the trade. They'd remained friends, and 6 months earlier, Greg had agreed to let Doug and his wife move into his basement. Over the years, Greg had amassed an impressive collection of Civil War memorabilia.
The other side to his personality, which he really lived for, which was collecting Civil War antiques and a passion for the American Civil War.
Don estimated his collection was worth more than $250,000 US, more than enough reason for someone to disappear. Don filed a missing persons report with Bellevue Chief of Police, Lynn Schwager. With a hunch that something wasn't right, he called on Special Agent Rick Rahn with the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation. The pair went to Greg May's home. He wasn't there. Neither were Doug and Julie Johnson.
One of the challenges was, did Mr. May move? Did he move and specifically not tell his family for whatever reason? Did he not move and did something happen to him? If something happened to him, who were these people that he lived with? We can't find anything on them. There were so many different possibilities that we had to consider at the beginning.
The police soon found Greg's SUV, abandoned in Aurora, Illinois, 145 miles from Bellevue. Despite a full forensic search, the car yielded nothing. But as soon as one door closed, another opened. The police received a lead concerning Doug Johnson. A local tattoo parlor claimed he had worked for them and that his real name was Doug DeBruyn. Soon afterwards, an Illinois auction house was found to be listing hundreds of items from Greg May's collection. The owner named the seller of the items as Julie Johnson. This was also quickly proved to be an alias. Her real name was Julie Miller. Were Doug and Julie really married? And why did they have Greg May's collection? The investigators located an address in Webster, Wisconsin, where Julie's mother lived. Concerned for her daughter's safety, she told them that Julie and Doug were living in a trailer park in Flagstaff, Arizona. The Iowa detectives immediately contacted the Flagstaff police, who arrested the couple. A search of their truck revealed further items from Greg May's valuable collection. The couple claimed that Greg had given them the items when they'd lived together, but the police weren't convinced. Also in the truck was a stained green jacket belonging to Doug DeBruyn and a notebook. These items were sent to the crime lab for testing. DeBruyn and Miller were detained on suspicion of selling stolen goods. They claimed they had no idea where Greg May was. But the police suspected them of murder, and as soon as they were in custody, they began to build their case. DeBruyn refused to answer any questions, but Julie Miller was more forthcoming. She told the police that she'd been in the basement when she'd heard a heated argument erupt upstairs between Doug and Greg, followed by dead silence.
And she said he was shaking and crying and obviously in shock, and basically stated, I killed him. I just killed him. It was an accident. I lost it and I hit him too hard and I killed him. At some point, she stated that she helped DeBruyn pick the body up and put it over his shoulder, and that he left the house with it. She assumes he put it in the Volvo and drove away and was gone for an hour and a half to 2 hours.
When Doug returned, he told Julie Greg always liked the Mississippi. That had led her to believe that he'd dumped Greg's body in the Mississippi River. The case was now officially a murder investigation. On further questioning, Julie Miller mentioned that on their travels, she and DeBruyn had sent historical letters to 2 museums, with handwritten notes from Greg May attached. Both museums handed over this evidence, which was sent to the police laboratory for analysis. The circumstantial evidence was mounting, but despite repeated searches, the police still didn't have a body. Meanwhile, DNA specialist Kristen Evans confirmed that the stain on the jacket was blood. To see if it was Greg's, she performed a reverse paternity test.
Reverse paternity testing is not something that we very frequently come across. Normally, in a paternity case, we have a profile of the known mother and the alleged father, and then the child's profiles. In this case, we didn't have a known from Greg May, and so we took the two children's profile, and having the mother's known profile, we were able to determine parts of what the father's profile would have to be.
Evans then compared her theoretical DNA profile of Greg May to the blood on Doug DeBruyn's jacket. There was a 99.99% probability that the blood was Greg May's. Next, forensic handwriting expert Gary Licht was called in. Licht examined the notebook found in Doug DeBruyn's truck. Handwriting impressions in the book listed an inventory of Greg May's antique collection. But was it written by Greg May himself?
Indented writings, or handwriting impressions, are those impressions that are left behind when somebody writes on a page above. I have an instrument called the electrostatic detection apparatus. It has a brass plate. The document in question is placed on that brass bed. A vacuum draws the document down tight. A mylar film is stretched over the top of that. An electrostatic charge is created, and then just simply by using very, very small glass beads which have a particular type of toner mixed with them, those beads and toner are cascaded over the top of the mylar film, and the toner selectively adheres to where there are paper fiber disturbances.
Licht then compared the writing in the notebook to the handwritten notes Miller and DeBruyn had sent to the two museums. The results left little doubt as to who had written them.
The letter was written by the person identified to me as Julie Miller.
With this new evidence, Julie Miller's involvement became more intriguing, and the murder case against Doug DeBruyn even more damning.
There's no reason for anyone to have sent that out unless they were trying to convince us that Greg May was alive. And there'd be no reason for Doug DeBruyn and Julie Miller to do that unless they knew he was dead and they had had something to do in killing him.
As the murder investigation continued in Iowa, another mystery was unfolding 400 miles away in the small town of Kearney, Missouri, one that would leave even veteran investigators stunned. In April 2001, 4 months after Greg May had disappeared, a concrete block had been dumped at a local truck stop. Sticking out of the top were human remains. A skull was buried upside down in the concrete. With no other means to identify the victim, the police would turn to an ingenious mix of art and science. Gregory May, a collector of Civil War memorabilia, had disappeared without a trace. So far, forensic technicians had used reverse paternity tests and handwriting analysis in their efforts to build a case. In a seemingly unrelated case, 400 miles away, a human skull had been found in a concrete block. To solve this mystery, investigators would turn to an ingenious mix of art and science. The police sought out Frank Bender, a renowned expert in forensic facial reconstruction. Taking the mystery skull, he first created a 3D model from sculpting clay, then fleshed it out according to a facial thickness chart. He then created a plaster cast of the finished form. Once it was set, he split it in two and removed the skull, then finessed the features and painted it. Part science and part art. The results were stunning. But it was another 4 years before the victim was identified as Greg May. 2 puzzling cases had finally converged. To confirm the identity, Bellevue Chief of Police Lynn Schwager shipped the skull to Greg May's dentist.
I've been a dentist for 31 years. Teeth are unique. They have many identifiable characteristics. Greg May had so many teeth restored, and I can identify my restorations. If I had one tooth with the records that I had and that one tooth, I could have identified Greg May. And I had many, many teeth. So it was a slam dunk as far as I'm concerned.
The case against Doug de Bruyn was now rock solid. A positive ID of Greg May's skull, Greg's blood on his jacket, forged letters, fenced property, and Julie Miller's eyewitness account of the crime. But the investigators still didn't have all the facts. The rest of Greg's body had never been found. The investigators decided to pay another visit to Julie Miller.
We purposely did not tell Miller that we had found the remains. Whether she had guessed it from our demeanor or through other sources, I don't know. But she became a lot more forthcoming. She told a pretty macabre and gruesome story that put her in the worst possible light, along with Doug de Bruyn. There had been a plan to kill Greg May. And the ruse that they had used was that de Bruyn was working on a tattoo of Miller's and invited Gregory May to look at it. Miller told us that as Gregory May bent over to look at the tattoo, Douglas de Bruyn took this opportunity to strangle him from behind. Now that's premeditation, and that's murder, and that was something a jury was going to understand.
Julie Miller described a scene of unimaginable horror. The investigators listened in stunned silence.
The body was placed on top of a washer and dryer with the head being placed over a utility sink. At that time, they sliced or cut off his head and used the sink to drain out much of the blood. And then she aided or assisted in the dismembering of the body to include cutting off the legs and the arms. The legs and the arms were placed in a black plastic bag or two and then thrown over a ditch north of town. And then the head was placed in a stocking cap and then placed in a bucket of concrete.
And she had talked about a rock wall as you were going down a hill, and it was a place on the highway where no one could see you. They had disposed of Mr. May's remains and turned around and headed back to Bellevue.
It was the final nail in the coffin of Doug de Bruyn. At trial, it took the jury less than an hour to find him guilty of first-degree theft and first-degree murder.
I believe that justice was served in this case. Douglas de Bruyn is now serving life imprisonment within the state of Iowa, which in Iowa, life is truly life, will not have the option of getting out.
Julie Miller was sentenced to 5 years for perjury. Although no charges were brought against her in connection with Greg May's death, his family is adamant that the weight of evidence against her will eventually lead to her prosecution. Some of the forensic procedures we have at our disposal are controversial. Some are inventive twists on old tried and tested methods. And sometimes, out-of-the-box thinking results in some truly groundbreaking techniques. Clues come in many shapes and forms, but if evidence at a crime scene exists, somewhere there's someone who can find it. Thanks to groundbreaking experts the world over, who knows what lies in the future of forensic science?